Following pre-recorded program is sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts. Welcome to About Money, a different approach to investing you won't hear anywhere else. Your host, Mike Adams, is a registered investment advisor and works with investment portfolios exceeding over $100,000 in net worth and has a proven track record of managing long-term investments, surpassing the markets in the long term. The information shared on the following program is for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. And now, here's Mike.
It is Saturday, and we are talking about money here on The Answer. So stay with me. We've got a lot to cover today. If you hear noise in the background, at Adams Financial Concepts, everyone has been working remotely from home for the past almost 13 or 14 months, since March of 2020. So we've got things going on and some remodeling going on here in the condo. So if you hear things in the background, that's what's happening. So don't be alarmed. Things are okay. So I've talked a few times about China and the rise of China. People now realize that China is probably our number one economic competition in the world. They want to replace the United States. But I think that the United States is going to be a country which emerges even stronger and better. But before we get to that story, and I want to get to that story, it's going to take a couple stories, a couple comments and allegories before we get there. I will get there. So just hang on. Don't go away. Also, I want to talk about a suit that was filed by and won by the Attorney General of the state of Washington because they won against a company that used scare tactics to scare people. Something that I've talked about using annuities, but this was even beyond that. So you want to hear what I have to say there. And we have a guest today that's really important and you want to hear as well. So hang on, let's get started, because there's an old expression that says the more things change, the more they stay the same. History doesn't repeat, but when looking at history, we can understand more about today and more about the opportunities. So I want to start by talking about Charles Lindbergh, 1927, the Spirit of St. Louis, and why. Just been thinking about and wanted to share it, and I think it applies here, because why did he get the nickname Lucky Lindy? To understand that, we have to go back, and we have to Ortig. Ortig was a hotel owner, born in France, moved to New York City. He started as a bar porter at Wing's Restaurant and Hotel. Then he became the maitre d' at the hotel, at the Martin Hotel. And he ended up buying the Martin Hotel and then several other hotels. So how is he related to Lucky Lindy? Well, in 1919, he attended a dinner organized by the Aero Club of America, honoring Flying Ace Eddie Rickenbacker. Many of the World War I airmen had been hanging around at Ortig's hotels. And Ortig was so inspired by Rickenbacker's speech that he stepped up and offered a prize of $25,000, which was huge in 1919, in those days, huge, to be the first person to fly from New York City to Paris. Now, France and the U.S. were having problems, and Ortig thought that this would help heal some of the relationship between France and the United States. So Ortig's price of $25,000 generated 9 teams, and those teams spent up to $400,000 to win. Several teams, headed by famous aviators, and they all failed. 6 men were killed in separate crashes. Another 3 men were injured in a 4th crash. The 6 men were killed in 3 because they were flying 2 people in a plane. But in the spring and summer of 1927, there would be 40 pilots who attend, and 21 would die trying to make that trip from New York City to Paris. Lucky Lindy? Well, Lucky Lindy, Lindbergh was not really taken seriously. He was not really the cream of the crop. And the way he chose to fly, they thought was crazy, because he chose to fly solo It wasn't a requirement to fly with a co-pilot, but it wasn't a good idea either. And almost everyone else chose to fly in pairs or even three. And not only that, Lucky Lindy, a single engine plane. And what that means, others were flying tri-engine planes or bi-engine planes, 2-engine, 3-engine planes, so that if one engine failed, you wouldn't plunge into the ocean and become shark bait. And so when he was the only one to complete that New York to Paris trip, he became known as Lucky Lindy, one of the least qualified, and yet he succeeded. He won the $25,000 prize. I mean, he was only one person. The others had spent up to $400,000. But he took his time and creative thinking, and he solved with creative thinking a very big industry. And it would lead, in fact, to a new industry, which today is between a $300 and $500 billion annual aviation market. But Ortega wasn't the one who invented incentive prizes. In 1714, the Brits posted 20,000 pounds to measure longitude, what it would take to cross by a ship. That was won in 1765 by John Harrison. And in 1795, Napoleon offered 12,000 francs to figure out how to preserve food for his troops going in and invading Russia. In 1823, 6,000 francs to develop the first commercial hydraulic turbine for the textile industry. Many, many others. In 1995, one of the most recent ones was the Ensign X Prize, $10 million to commercialize human flight. Or, and there were 350 teams from 20 nations. There was the X Challenge, Wendy Schmidt of Oil Cleanup, to clean up the BP oil spill. 200 million gallons, 18 times the size of Exxon Valdez. It covered 2,500 to 4,000 square miles. And figuring using traditional methods, they would have only recovered 69 million gallons out of that 200 million gallons that were spilled. Natural dispersion and evaporation would do 84 million more. But that left 53 million gallons uncleaned. But that was using traditional methods. The winning team that came up with a method to clean the oil cleaned 89.5%. Almost 90% of the oil was cleaned up, considering the old methods would have been less than 35% of the oil. Many teams from the oil industry. But one of the top teams was from a tattoo parlor in Las Vegas. They had no experience, but they were one of the top 10. Now, all of this whole thing that I've been talking about is because these are things that were creative. They were beyond the norm. They were not the large companies. Large companies, they're not as nimble as individuals, not as nimble as small teams. And big companies cannot take the risk. They think along company lines. So the only constant is change, and the rate of change is changing, and disruption is now a fact of business life. That's why we have quirky individuals who develop things like the iPad or electric vehicles or moon rockets. It's done by individuals and not big companies. It's disruption because big companies don't do it. Now, those prizes went out to everybody in the world, and that happens because even other cultures generate people that understand that. But in my 35 years in the brokerage industry and in financial services, 35 years, I've had tickets to the Mariners. And this is the second story that goes along with this and comes to this. Because baseball is the America's game. You see, it's sad to see a losing team, but we live in a baseball culture. What separates American culture from Asian countries or Arab countries, or European countries for that matter, is what I call the baseball culture. When I talked about China and the rise of China, I believe what wins for America is because we're a baseball culture. Why? Why do I say that? Because the very best hitters fail almost 70% of the time. The worst players succeed 20% of the time. The best players hit 333. They get paid a huge amount when they do that, but they fail 2/3 of the time. There's not much of a difference. The worst players succeed almost as often as the best. They succeed 20% of the time versus 33 for the best players, and that's not much of a difference. But you know, one thing, when you look at American entrepreneurs, they have one thing in common with each other, and that usually is failure. In fact, they've coined the term fail forward. It means they accept the fact that they could fail, but if they fail, they're going to get up and go again. It's very hard to find a very wealthy person who's built their wealth individually who hasn't failed at least once or twice or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times. And that's been the history of America. We're going to come back to this and finish this off and how it applies to investing. So stay with me, and we'll be right back after the commercial break. And if you missed part of this program or some of the others, you can find them on YouTube. Check About Money on YouTube. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on Adams Financial Concepts. About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So I've been talking about entrepreneurship and why I believe that America will win the race against China and other countries. It's the culture, and I call it the baseball culture. Because baseball culture, the very best, fails 70% of the time, or between 60 and 70% of the time. And I believe that if you look at wealthy entrepreneurs who have built their businesses almost from scratch, you find that they fail once or twice or 3 or 4 times before they succeed. Even coined the phrase, as I mentioned, fail forward. They learned what didn't work in the first effort, and they don't repeat it in the next. Think about Steve Jobs. He failed at Apple, got kicked out of Apple, started next, but came back to Apple because he learned from the first failure to come to the second. And if you look at successful people, that's very, very often what they find. They don't give up, and they don't stop trying. They come back again and again and again. If you look at the state of Washington, in the month of January 2021, over 8,000 new businesses started up. That's a record number. And we're not even out of the pandemic yet. And over 6,000 of those will have employees, not single proprietorships, not starting out, but they'll actually begin to employ people. And I don't have the stats for all of the U.S., but if you look at the first half of 2020, U.S. businesses skyrocketed. We hear about all the bankruptcies that happened. We don't hear very much about the skyrocketing new businesses that have been formed. And that's only happened in the United States. It didn't happen in any of the rest of the world. Record numbers of startups. We didn't see it in the Great Recession. We didn't see it during the dot-com time or the dot-com bust time. But we saw it. During the pandemic, we've seen an explosion of new businesses. And for me, it's really encouraging. It's encouraging about what it means for the economy. It's encouraging about changes. And yes, some will fail, but many will fail forward and go on. And that's why the study by Richard Foster of Yale showed that the average age of businesses in 1920 in the Standard & Poor's, the average age of those businesses, they lasted 70 years. The average age today is less than 15 years. This entrepreneurial spirit, this entrepreneurial thing that's going forward, yes, there'll be companies in other countries that start. Yes, they'll be successful. Yes, some will go into mega mega businesses, but I believe that America has a culture which will take us forward and go even further. And that, talking about baseball brings me to another analogy, because in modern baseball, there were 7 players that hit over 400 12 times. That happened between 1903 to 1950. But since 1950, there's not been one who's done that. In the last 60 years, not one. Prior to 1950, the average player hit 250 to 260 pretty steadily. In the modern day of baseball, 1950 to 2021, the average player has been hitting between 250 and 260, same as they did before 1950. And yet, the number of players who hit 400 is 0 since 1950. 12 times it was done prior to that. So what's happened? The standard deviation has dropped from 40.6 on an average in 1921 to 26.1 in 2003. And it's dropped even lower as we get to 2020. If you look at a 5 standard deviation event, 1 standard deviation includes 68% of the people. 2 standard deviations, 95. 3 standard deviations, 99%. 5 standard deviations is 1 chance in 3.5 million. So what's happened today? The players are more skilled. I can remember when Mike Moore was the #1 player selected in the baseball draft. He was selected by the Seattle Mariners, who had finished dead last. Not an uncommon place for the Seattle Mariners. Hopefully they won't be there very much longer. But in 1992, there was a big 1-page or 2-page article in the Seattle Times talking about Mike Moore's dominating 95-mile-an-hour pitch. 1982. That was just 30 years ago. 95 was an incredible speed. Very few pitchers could match that. Today you have multiple pitchers who throw 100 miles plus. And you're looking at many pitchers who throw in the high 90s, much greater speed than Moore threw. And to give you a perspective, from the time the ball leaves the pitcher's hand until it hits the catcher's glove is 0.3 of a second. So that gives you some idea of what's happening. The hitters are better, the pitchers are better, and there was a Credit Suisse report done by Mobazin and Dallahan that said alpha and paradox of skill. I think it applies with this because they said that the standard deviation since 1967 in my industry, in the financial services industry, has been declining from 16% to about 6% for performance. Fewer worse people, fewer that are beating the S&P 500. Only according to Fama and French. Fama shared the Nobel Prize in 2013, showing that only 1 or 2% of money managers outperform the Standard & Poor's 500 by a couple percent. Fama said that only 7% did as well as their fees. There was another study done in 2013 called the Skill in Active Managers that said the rising skill is not due to an increase in the number of firms. It's that the new funds are more skilled than the existing funds. Younger people outperform the older people. Managers like Buffett, like Ted Williams, who was the great baseball hitter, they're not really around much longer. That is something that there's very few of us that are actually left that are doing that well. That's baseball today. And baseball season is kicked off, baseball is rolling, and so I wanted to bring that home. I believe that there's very few money managers that can really compete with what I do, and there's very few of us that can do that kind of return. And we live in an American culture which is a baseball culture because it is all about learning to fail forward. And that's where we are. I believe that'll be the success. And that creates businesses entrepreneurs who have failed before will build businesses that will continue to grow and become new businesses. Businesses today we haven't even seen yet will be part of the Standard & Poor's within a few years. We need to be ahead of the curve instead of behind the curve. We need to understand what's going to be happening. We need to look at the technology, the demographics, and the lifestyles to really have a positive return for our clients. But with that said, I want to turn up now to my guest, Michael Schneider of Edelman. You want to hear what he has to say. Welcome to the program, Michael.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Mike.
So why don't we start with your background?
Sure. Well, I'm an architect. Grew up thinking I was going to be an architect when I was in about the 4th grade. I think an aunt told me she liked the buildings that I drew, and she said, "You ought to be an architect." So I said, "Okay, I guess I'll be an architect." And went to the school at the University of Illinois and pursued a practice of conventional architecture in Southern California as a designer for a number of years, and then leveraged my experience with a master's in business administration to do more project construction management for most of the rest of my career, and have led a couple of companies, and right now own a company here in Seattle, Endelman and Associates, founded by Bill Endelman about 27 years ago. Bill and I have been partners in crime for a number of years, working together and actually developing a program for providing consulting compliance for issues related to accessibility. And what that means is the ADA and the Fair Housing Act.
So when you say the ADA, American Disabilities Act, and you work on designing access, we're going to come back to that and talk about that right after the commercial break, and we are coming to a commercial break. So I want you, the listeners, to stay with me. You want to hear what Michael has to say. You want to hear because it's significant, it's a change, and if anything, America led the way in this area as well. And Michael was one of those. So you want to hear what he has to say. If you miss any of this program, you can find it on YouTube by checking About Money. You'll find a number of our programs are on there. You can sign up for our newsletter by sending me an email, mike@adamsfinancialconcepts.com, and I can sign you up for the newsletter. You can as well check our website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. You can see our blog, which contains a lot of the information on the radio programs and takes it beyond the radio programs. You can also see the performance that I talked about earlier in the program. You can see what we've done, how we've done, and why we are showing a record of beating the market. And I always have to say past performance is no guarantee of future results. You'll find all the disclaimers there. You'll also see that since the bottom and the Great Recession, we've turned $100,000 into $1 million. We're about to publish our new results, which will show very solid continued growth. So don't go away. Stay with us after this commercial break because we've got a lot more to say, and we want to hear what Michael has to say.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on Adams Financial Concepts. About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
So, welcome back, and I just want to remind people once again that we've got some remodeling going on at the condo. Everybody's been working at home for over a year and working remotely. So just to remind you, if you hear noise in the background, that's what's happening. And let's go back. I started talking to Michael Schneider of Edelman. We talked about Edelman. So Michael, welcome back. And let's talk about Edelman and what you do.
Well, our company consists of 12 people, and we are primarily architects or building officials, former building officials, or construction-related managers. And our focus is on understanding the design and construction of buildings, a variety of different buildings, and to see if they are in compliance with primarily two major regulations, the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. And the Americans with Disabilities Act is mostly applied to buildings like offices and hotels and retail and that type of facility, where the Fair Housing Act, as the title would suggest, is related to housing, and specifically multifamily housing. And so our group will review for either an owner or an architect or a contractor the design of the project at different phases of the design to determine if it meets all of the requirements. And then we participate during the construction by visiting the site 3 or 4 times in order to determine it's being actually built in accordance with the plans. Toward the end of being able to release a letter that says that the building complies with all the requirements for accessibility.
So in doing that, we talk about the American Disabilities Act, but when you think about it, we're not just talking about people who have certain disabilities. As we get older, we tend to have more disabilities, correct?
Well, that's right. Actually, there may be some clarifications that we need to think about in terms of accessibility. We really need to consider that most of us are only temporarily able-bodied, that age or illness or injury is going to put us in the path of being disabled, or more correctly stated, differently abled. The formerly disabled community, the moniker that was used, disabled, which replaced handicapped, has now evolved to being differently able to describe people that have conditions like mobility impairment or vision or hearing impairments. And we're all, as I said, we're all going to be subject to it at least some point in time in our lives as infants and as old people and everybody in between.
And at my age, I'm now getting to the age where I sometimes use the magnifying glass to see things on the computer. I need hearing. So, I mean, it's something that becomes important. You don't think about it when you're 20 or 30 or 40 years old, but as you get older, you do begin to think about these things, and the accessibility is a big thing. So what's important about, or what criteria changes, or what's necessary for the design for accessibility? I don't know if I'm saying that correctly.
Well, I think I get your point. What's different about an accessible environment versus one that's not?
Correct.
And there are certain standards that are provided under accessibility compliance, which includes what we call building blocks, like how big does the space need to be for a wheelchair? How big a space do you need to actually take a wheelchair and turn it 360 degrees? What's a reasonable length to expect somebody to reach over an obstruction to get to an operable part, which is like a switch or an outlet or a control? How high should something be for a reach? How low should it be so that somebody in a wheelchair, in this case I'm speaking completely about mobility impairments, but where do those objects need to be in order to have an environment that is workable? And as you can imagine, there's more real estate involved with clear floor spaces for wheelchairs than there would be if you didn't have that requirement. So usually in residences and also in public accommodations like offices, you'll find that accessible spaces are larger, no surprise. When you walk into a public restroom, there's usually an accessible toilet stall, and it's bigger than all the others, as you would expect it would need to be for somebody who has a disability to be able to use it. For people that have vision impairments, we have to watch out for things like what are protruding objects that they might run into, not knowing what's coming up, and so there's limitations as far as what we call a detectable edge to identify where something is going to be a potential obstruction for a person that's walking along an accessible route. So those are some of the differences that you would have for accessible compliance, accessibility compliance, that would not be necessary in an environment where you didn't have to provide compliance for either mobility or for communications like hearing and seeing.
And what about in the kitchen?
Kitchen's a great example of where most of the accessible components show up. In many kitchens, in all kitchens, there needs to be an accessible path to get to each of the appliances, and what that needs to look like in terms of an approach that's either a forward approach or a parallel approach, or if it goes underneath the counter or it stays outside the counter, or what the width of the kitchen needs to be between the face of an appliance and the edge of a countertop, or the height of that switch that controls the light or the exhaust fan over the range. Where does that switch need to be? And it's over an obstruction. How tall can that obstruction be? How deep can it be and still provide access to that component? So kitchens contain a lot of criteria that are involved with the accessibility compliance, and bathrooms are not surprisingly one of the other locations where many of the regulations occur, one of which is having support in the walls for future installation of grab bars at bathing fixtures and toilets.
And that's all important too. What about the shelving in the kitchens? How does that, and the cabinets in the kitchen?
Could you ask the question again? Sorry.
What about the cabinets in the kitchen to make them most accessible?
Yes, of course, they need to be in a location where the reach can provide access to most of the contents that are in those cabinets. Clearly, when you have a pantry and it has storage that extends a lot higher than what I would constitute to be the reach range from a seated clear floor space where a wheelchair would be. Anything above 48 inches is really out of the reach range, and anything below 15 inches is also outside the reach range. But in between is where you provide access for contents that you would normally store in a pantry, and those would be at an accessible level. And certainly that would translate over into cabinetry in general for things like pots and pans and dishes and the like.
So it's all really fascinating. It's all really important. So your work is involved primarily in what percentage of your work is residential and what percentage is non-residential?
Sure. We're about 75% of our work is multifamily residential, and the balance, the 25%, is going to be office, hospitality, retail, sports venues, hospitals, other healthcare kinds of facilities. So that's kind of the mix, and our location is national. All of our design reviews occur in Seattle, and we travel to the locations where the projects are being built, and they're built all around the country, and we have a very deep list of clients over the years, writing contracts or proposals, if not full contracts, to some 1,500 clients.
So, Michael, tell the listeners how they can get a hold of you if somebody is building a multifamily or commercial building. Tell us how they can connect with you.
You bet. So the best way to get a hold of me is through my email, and it would be michael@endelman, ENDELMAN.com. And that's for Endelman and Associates. And then there's another good resource nationally, which is corada.org, CORADA.org. And that's a resource center for accessibility work.
Thanks for being on, Michael. And if you're listening to this program, do contact Michael. We'll be back right after this break.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on Adams Financial Concepts. About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So, I want to finish by talking about two things. One, a King County judge has ruled that a company that provides estate planning services must pay 1,100 people in the state of Washington over $6 million because they use scare tactics to pressure people into buying their products. Similar tactic to what people use to sell annuities. And I also want to talk about a Carnegie Mellon study about why people continue to pour money into bad investments. So those two things I want to cover quickly. So the Texas-based CLA Estate Services must pay $6.5 million in civil penalties and $1.8 million in attorney's costs because they lost a suit to the Washington Attorney General. And I think it's just awesome because companies that use scare tactics and scare people into believing that their money is going to be protected, they usually get into investments which are heavily fee-based, hidden fee-based, and the performance is generally poor. If you look at annuities, there's a big push on annuities, and the sales tactic is always the same. It's to scare people to death and not mention annuities until the very end when they say, but here's our solution. That was the same tactic that CLA Estate Services used in using that and building up and saying, this is the way in which you can protect your money, and in fact, it didn't protect their money because people lost $6 million. That's terrible. It was used on seniors, which are the main target, the most vulnerable, and they did it through home visits and licensed insurance agents. And believe me, those insurance agents made a lot of money. It was the poor seniors that lost. I'm happy to see that. I hope there's a lot more that happens for that reason. Sadly, if you receive a very small return on your investment, you can't get your money back, even if it's 1 or 2 or 3%. It's sad. But anyway, I'm happy to see one suit go. The second thing I want to talk about is, why do people keep pumping money into bad investments? Christopher Olivada at my old alma mater, Carnegie Mellon University, did a study, and he starts the study by posing a question to 602 people. The question is this: you've obtained courtside seats to an NBA basketball game. Courtside seats, right there along the courtside. And the day of the game, there's a terrible storm. Terrible, horrible storm that slows, and potentially it's going to slow your access to the game. It's going to slow down your traffic. It's going to potentially be hazardous to get to the game. And it's too late to exchange your tickets. It's too late to give them to someone else. So how would you react? How would you react if you'd been just given the tickets from a friend. It cost them nothing. It cost you nothing. How would you react? On the other hand, if someone told you that their friend had paid $200 for the tickets, but they gave them to you for free, how would you react? And finally, a third group was told that they'd paid $200 for the tickets themselves. Would you go to the game knowing that traffic was going to be slow, knowing that it was potentially hazardous, the storm was going to be terrible, it was going to be slow going, it was going to be slow coming home, it was going to be hazardous both ways? Would you go? So significantly more in the group that actually paid for the tickets said yes, they would go. The fewest were the group who were told their friend got the tickets for free and gave them to you for free. So the whole point of that whole questionnaire was to find the question, why do people continue to put money into losing investments? He did the same question for tennis club memberships and for movies and for chocolate cake. And each time he repeated that study, the answers were always the same. It's what he called the sunk cost fallacy. Investors continue to pour money into losing investments, whether it be a limited partnership or business venture or some of the other things. Sometimes it's a stock. Sometimes people can't bring themselves to saying, I've lost, so no more. Sometimes I've heard the expression of people saying, I bought this stock, it's way down, I'm going to wait until it breaks even and then I'm going to sell it. That's a crazy idea. If you're one of those people, I'm sorry, but it is crazy. If the stock is down, you have a decision to make. Peter Lynch said it, when a stock is down 25%, if you can't convince yourself you're a buyer and not a seller, you'll never have better than mediocre results. There are times when I have stocks that are down 10 or 15 or 25%. It's a decision time. Do you say, I made a mistake and I'm going to move on? And I have done that with stocks in my client portfolios. It's a mistake. Going back to why I bought it in the first place, it made all the sense, and if I had to do it over again, I would buy it. But now that we're down 20%, it was a mistake. We're just going to sell it and move on and find something that's going to deliver better results. Never, ever do I say, I'll just wait until it breaks even and then sell. No, it's time to make a decision at that point when it's down. Do I buy more or do I sell? But too often, people will look at their stocks and see a stock that is down and think that they need to hold on to it to break even. That's a wrong choice. If it's down, you have to make a decision. Do I want to buy more or do I want to sell what I have and move on? And don't just sell to move on, because if you expect a stock to go from 20 to 40 and instead it goes from 20 to 15, decision time. Is it still going to make it to 40, what you thought it was going to? It's even a better buy at 15 than it was at 20, if that's going to be the case. That's the decision that needs to be made. That's the decision that's the right decision. Doing anything else is wrong, but if you see the stock down at 15 and say, I made a mistake, the best thing to do is to sell it. That's where things are. Sometimes you have a stock where the news comes out and it's bad news in the industry, and the stock drops, not because the stock is anything wrong, but because the stock drops. Or the stock makes their earnings and their forecast for the future is less bright. A lot of times companies will try to manage expectations by shooting for targets that are lower than they expect to make. Those are things that you have to consider when you're looking and evaluating a stock. Not what you bought it at. It's the current price today. What is the price today? What is the price you expect it to be? And at what time? The perfect stock for me is one that if you knew it was going from $10 to $1,000 and you had 30 years, you continued to buy it at $10 until it went in 1 year to 1,000, but most people prefer a stock that goes to 990 and then levels out there. Think about that for a while. I'll leave that whole idea with you as we come to the end of the day today, but I will wish you a very good weekend and a very good week. And the market is doing well. The economy is doing well. The risk today is not being out of stocks. The risk, or being in stocks, the risk today is being out of stocks. Have a good weekend and a good week. I will be back next Saturday to talk about money.
Listening to About Money with Mike Adams, a registered investment advisor. If you'd like more information about what you heard today, or about Mike's investment philosophy and strategy, or if you'd like Mike to evaluate your own portfolio, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. The information shared in the preceding program was for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. Join us again next Saturday at noon for more About Money with Mike Adams, here on AM 1590. The Answer. The preceding program was sponsored by Adams Financial.